The dust of redemption was a fine, gritty powder that settled on everything, a constant reminder that life here was carved from the unforgiving earth. It coated the brim of Jacob Vance's hat, settled in the lines around his eyes, and tasted of sun-scorched rock. The midday sun beat down with a brassy, relentless glare, bleaching the color from the wooden facades of the town's main street. Heat shimmered over the distant mesas, making the horizon tremble. It was a day like any other, until the sharp crack of a gunshot shattered the sleepy afternoon calm. Dust choked the air. Gunshots echoed. Jacob froze. He had been on his way out of the general store, a sack of flour slung over one shoulder, when the chaos erupted from the Redemption Bank and Trust. Men in dark dusters' bandanas, pulled high over their faces, herded terrified townsfolk into the street. Their leader stood apart, a man whose calm demeanor was more terrifying than the wild-eyed panic of his subordinates. He wore no mask. His face was sharp and intelligent, framed by dark hair, and his eyes, cold as a winter sky, scanned the scene with an air of absolute command. This was Silas Kane, the man who had arrived in Redemption 6 months ago with a seemingly endless supply of money and an ambition that felt like a shadow stretching over the valley. He was buying up land, strangling small ranchers with predatory loans, and the town was too afraid to do anything but whisper. Jacob, caught in the sudden maelstrom, dropped the flour sack. It split open, a cloud of white puffing up from the boardwalk. Through the haze of dust and fear, his eyes locked with Silas Kane's. There was no flicker of recognition in Kane's gaze, only a cool, detached assessment. He turned back to the bank, his voice cutting through the ringing in Jacob's ears, clear and precise. "The safe, Mr. Abernathy. Now." "Old man Abernathy." The bank manager stumbled out his hands, trembling so violently he could barely hold them aloft. Kane's men were stuffing canvas bags with cash, but Kane himself ignored them. He followed Abernathy back inside, his movements fluid and deliberate. Jacob felt an inexplicable pull, a need to see this through. He moved cautiously, using the corner of the blacksmith's forge for cover, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the bank's grime-streaked window, he saw the scene unfold. Abernathy worked the combination on the large iron safe, his fumbling fingers slick with sweat. The heavy door swung open. Kane's men made a move toward it, but Kane held up a hand, silencing them with a single gesture. He reached inside past the stacks of currency and coin, and his fingers closed around a small, specific object. He drew it out into the light. It was a silver pocket watch. Even from a distance, Jacob recognized it. The intricate engraving of an oak tree on the casing, the fine silver chain. It was his father's watch, the one he had been forced to use as collateral on the loan that kept his ranch afloat. The Vance family crest, a symbol of a legacy built over generations of honor and hard work. Kane didn't even glance at the money. He tucked the watch into his waistcoat pocket with a small, satisfied smile. This wasn't just a robbery. It was a message. It was personal. The cold dread that had coiled in Jacob's gut turned to a hot, searing anger. That watch was more than silver and gears. It was the last tangible piece of the man he'd idolized, the father whose memory he fought every day to honor. Kane emerged from the bank, his men close behind their bags, heavy with the town's money. He mounted a sleek black stallion, his posture as impeccable as a gentleman in a drawing room. For a moment, his gaze swept the street again, and this time, when it found Jacob, a flicker of something amusement, perhaps triumph, danced in his cold eyes. Then he spurred his horse, and his gang galloped out of town, leaving behind a cloud of dust, a ransacked bank, and a silence more profound than the noise that had preceded it. The townsfolk slowly picked themselves up. Whispers turned to frightened murmurs. Did you see his eyes? He took everything. But Jacob heard none of it. He was staring at the empty space where Cain had been, the dust settling back onto the street. The theft of the town's money was a crime. The theft of that watch was a desecration. In that single calculated act, Silas Cain had not only robbed a bank, he had stolen a piece of Jacob Vance's soul, and in doing so had declared a war Jacob had no choice but to fight. The Vance Ranch was a testament to stubborn persistence. Nestled in a valley where the creek ran thin in summer, its fences were a patchwork of new pine and weathered gray wood, each section a story of a break, mended a season endured. The two-story house built by Jacob's grandfather stood against the vast, empty sky, its paint peeling under the relentless sun. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood leather and the lingering memory of his father, Thomas Vance. Thomas's portrait hung over the stone fireplace, a stern but kind-faced man, with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of the land itself. To Jacob, that portrait was a sacred text. His father had been more than a rancher. He was a pillar of the community, a man whose handshake was his bond, whose legacy was etched into every acre of this land. Since his passing 2 years ago, Jacob had worked himself to the bone, trying to live up to that impossible standard. He ran the ranch alone, the weight of his father's memory, a constant companion, a source of both strength and crushing pressure. But the land was hard, the rains had been sparse, and the ranch was bleeding money. The silver watch had been the final desperate measure to secure the loan that had seen him through the winter. Now even that was gone. A trophy in the pocket of a man who represented everything his father had stood against. The day after the robbery, Jacob rode the perimeter of his property, his jaw set in a hard line. The anger from yesterday had cooled into a grim resolve. He found a section of fence trampled near the western ridge. Cattle tracks, not his. He dismounted, studying the prints with a practiced eye. They led toward the neighboring property, the Cimarron Creek Ranch. Ilara's ranch. He found her resetting a post, her movements efficient and strong. Ilara was as much a fixture of this land as the mesas. She'd inherited her ranch from her parents, just as he had, but she wore the responsibility with a pragmatic ease that Jacob envied. Her face was sun-kissed and framed by a braid of dark hair that had escaped her hat. She didn't stop her work as he approached. "Your cattle, I presume?" Jacob set his voice gruff as he gestured with his chin toward the broken fence. Ilara wiped a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of her glove. "They seem to prefer your grass. Can't say I blame them. It's a little less brown than mine." Her tone was light, but her eyes were sharp, analytical. She met his gaze. "I heard what happened in town. You all right?" "I'm fine." The words were clipped. She leaned the post-hole digger against the fence and crossed her arms. "You don't look fine, Jacob. You look like you're about to declare a one-man war on Silas Cain." "He stole my father's watch." "He stole the bank's money," she corrected gently. "The watch was collateral. It belonged to the bank." Her practicality felt like a slap. "It was my father's," he repeated, his voice low and tight. "It means something?" Ilara sighed, her gaze softening slightly. "I know it does. Your father was a good man. But revering his memory won't solve your problems. Cain is a snake, and he's coiling himself around this entire valley. He owns the water rights upstream, he's buying out ranchers who can't make their payments, and now he's robbing the bank that holds the loans for the rest of us. This is bigger than a watch." Her words were true, but they didn't extinguish the fire in his gut. They only fed it. "People are afraid," Jacob said, looking out over the valley. "They see Cain's money, his hired guns. They just stand by and watch." And what are you going to do, ride into his compound with a 6-gun and a righteous heart?" she challenged. "Your pride will get you buried, Jacob. Your father was honorable, yes, but he was also smart. He wouldn't have faced a man like Cain head-on without a plan." The comparison stung. He felt the constant nagging fear that he wasn't as smart, as strong, as capable as his father. "I have to get it back," he said, more to himself than to her. Elara watched him for a long moment, a flicker of concern in her eyes. "Be careful," she said finally, turning back to her fence post. "Cain doesn't just want land. He wants power, and he crushes anyone who stands in his way." Jacob mounted his horse and rode back to his silent house. Elara's words echoed in his mind, a dissonant counterpoint to the righteous anger that fueled him. The town lived in the shadow of Cain's influence. The saloon went quiet when his men walked in. Sheriff Miller, a man past his prime, seemed to find a sudden interest in his paperwork whenever Cain's name was mentioned. Fear was a currency, and Silas Cain was the wealthiest man in Redemption. That evening, Jacob sat at his father's old oak desk, the ledger books open before him. The numbers told a grim story of drought and debt. He was failing. The legacy he was trying so desperately to protect was slipping through his fingers like dry soil. He ran a hand over his face, the weariness settling deep into his bones. He wasn't just fighting for a watch. He was fighting for his father's name, for his home. He was fighting against the terrifying possibility that he wasn't man enough to hold on to either. A week passed thick with an uneasy silence. The town of Redemption tried to return to its rhythm, but the ghost of the robbery lingered. People spoke in hushed tones, casting nervous glances at the road, as if expecting Cain's riders to reappear at any moment. For Jacob, the silence was a tightening coil of suspense. He waited for Cain's next move, knowing with a certainty that settled in his bones that the stolen watch was not the end of it. It was the opening salvo. The move came on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. The air was still and heavy, promising a thunderstorm that refused to break. Jacob was reinforcing a corral gate when he saw the lone rider approaching. It wasn't one of Cain's thuggish enforcers, but a clerk from the lawyer's office in town, a scrawny young man who looked like he might faint from the heat. He dismounted, mopping his brow with a handkerchief, and handed Jacob a sealed envelope. From Mr. Cain's legal representative. The clerk mumbled, refusing to meet Jacob's eyes, before scurrying back to his horse and riding away, as if the devil himself were at his heels. Jacob's hands felt strangely numb as he broke the wax seal. The paper was crisp, the ink a cold, impersonal black. He read the legal jargon, the words blurring together until they resolved into a single brutal point. A foreclosure notice. The loan, the one his father's watch had secured, had been bought out by Cain Enterprises. Due to the instability and recent losses suffered by the Redemption Bank and Trust, all outstanding debts had been acquired. His payment was due in full, in 30 days, an impossible sum. The paper trembled in his hand. This was Cain's plan all along. The robbery wasn't for the money in the vault. It was a strategic maneuver to destabilize the bank, allowing him to purchase its debt at a fraction of the cost. He hadn't just stolen the collateral. He had bought the chain it was attached to. Now he was pulling that chain, intent on dragging Jacob under. He wanted the ranch. He wanted to wipe the Vance name from this valley. A cold, helpless fury washed over him, so potent it made him feel dizzy. He looked around at the ranch, the house his grandfather built, the fields his father tilled, the fences he himself had mended with bloody hands. It was all about to be stripped away by a man who saw it as nothing more than a square on a map. He stormed into the house, the foreclosure notice crumpled in his fist. He slammed it down on the desk right next to the bleak, unforgiving ledgers. Ilara's voice came back to him. "This is bigger than a watch." She was right. The watch was a symbol, a taunt. The true prize was the land, the legacy. And Silas Kane was systematically dismantling it, piece by piece. The carefully constructed image of his father, the wise, untouchable patriarch, offered no comfort. Honor and a good name were no defense against a foreclosure notice. His father's legacy was not a shield. It was a burden, a weight that was about to drown him. The fight was no longer a matter of pride. It was a matter of survival. He had 30 days. 30 days to find a way to fight a man who held all the cards. 30 days before everything his family had built over 3 generations was reduced to another asset in Silas Kane's portfolio. The distant rumble of thunder finally broke the silence, a low, menacing growl that mirrored the storm gathering inside him. The robbery was the spark, but this was the declaration of war. Silas Kane wanted to destroy him, and now Jacob knew why. It wasn't about greed. It was about annihilation. Desperation was a bitter taste in Jacob's mouth, as metallic and sharp as a spent cartridge. The day after receiving the notice, he rode into redemption with a single-minded purpose to secure a new loan. He felt the weight of the town's eyes on him as he tied his horse outside the temporary office of the Redemption Bank, now operating out of the back of the general store. Mr. Abernathy looked even older than he had a week ago, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I'm sorry, Jacob," he said, not even bothering to look at the paperwork Jacob presented. "Kane bought up almost all our debt. The bank is barely solvent. We have no capital to lend. No one does." Jacob's jaw tightened. "So he cripples you, then buys your assets for pennies on the dollar." Abernathy nodded grimly. "He's a vulture in a tailored suit. I'd help you if I could, you know that. Your father, Thomas, was a good man. He helped this town more times than I can count." The words of praise for his father felt like ashes in his mouth. What good was a respected name against a locked vault? He tried the other merchants, the wealthy cattle brokers, anyone who might have the capital. The answers were all the same, delivered with apologetic eyes and hushed tones. They were afraid. To lend money to Jacob Vance would be to openly defy Silas Kane, and no one in Redemption had the stomach for that. Kane's power was absolute, a silent, suffocating blanket over the town. Defeated Jacob returned to the ranch as dusk painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. The house felt cavernous and empty. The portrait of his father seemed to watch him, its painted eyes a silent judgment. For the first time, a sliver of resentment pierced through his grief and reverence. "You left me this fight." He thought the sentiment feeling like a betrayal, "but you didn't leave me the tools to win it." He couldn't sit still. He couldn't face the accusatory silence of the ledger books. He needed a solution, a forgotten asset, an old contract, anything. He found himself at his father's desk, the place where Thomas Vance had managed the ranch with quiet competence for 40 years. He pulled open the drawers, sifting through yellow deeds receipts for livestock and letters from family long gone. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he searched with a frantic energy born of dwindling hope. In the back of the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a stack of old maps, his fingers brushed against a small leather-bound box. He didn't recognize it. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, were his father's personal effects, a tie pin, a pair of cufflinks, and a bundle of letters tied with a thin, brittle ribbon. Most were from his mother. But one was different. The envelope was old and the paper thin and fragile. The postmark was from Silver Creek, a played-out mining town 2 days' ride north. The handwriting was not his mother's. It was jagged and hurried. He carefully unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. It wasn't a full letter, more like a fragment, a single page that had become separated from the rest. Cannot accept your terms, Thomas. To dissolve the partnership now is to leave my family with nothing. The collapse was an accident, a tragedy for us all. But your proposal is an act of betrayal. You would save your own skin and leave me to the wolves. This is not the end of it. The debt owed to the Kane family will be paid one way or another. I swear it. Jacob read the words again, his blood running cold. The Kane family. He slumped into the chair, the fragile paper shaking in his hand. A partnership his father had been partners with, a Kane. He had never spoken of it. There were no records of it in the ranch's official ledgers. It was a secret buried deep in the past. And it was a secret that had ended in accusations of betrayal and threats of a debt to be paid. This wasn't just about land or money. This was an old wound, a ghost from the past, that had returned in the form of Silas Kane. The robbery, the foreclosure, it was all part of a larger, darker story that had begun decades ago in a mining town called Silver Creek. He looked up at his father's portrait, at the image of the unimpeachable, honorable man he had worshipped his entire life. For the first time, he saw a stranger. The letter was a crack in the foundation of everything he believed. It was the first clue in a mystery he now had to solve, not just to save his ranch, but to understand the truth of the man whose legacy he was about to lose. The next morning, the sun rose pale and thin, casting long skeletal shadows from the cacti. Jacob rode to the Cimarron Creek Ranch, the cryptic letter tucked securely in his saddlebag. He found Alara by the creek, watching her herd drink. The air between them was tense as he told her what he'd found. She read the letter, her expression unreadable. Silver Creek, she said, her voice quiet. My father used to talk about it. Said it was a boom town that went bust overnight, a big mine collapse. She handed the paper back to him. So Kane isn't just a land grabber. This is a vendetta. My father never mentioned a partnership. Jacob said the words tasting like a lie. He never spoke of a Kane family. People have secrets, Jacob. Alara said, her gaze direct. Even the best of them. She looked from the letter to his face, a new understanding dawning in her eyes. You're going to Silver Creek. It wasn't a question. I have to know the truth. You can't go alone. She stated, her tone firm. Kane's men will be watching you. If they suspect you're digging into his past, they won't hesitate to put you in the ground. This isn't your fight alone anymore. Kane is a threat to all of us. She paused, then added, besides, my father knew people in that town. Maybe some of the old-timers are still around. Jacob felt a surge of gratitude so strong it caught him off guard. He had felt utterly alone in this fight, but now he had an ally. A reluctant one, perhaps, but an ally nonetheless. All right. He nodded. We leave at dawn. The journey to Silver Creek was 2 days of hard riding through a landscape of stark, brutal beauty. They spoke little, the shared purpose creating a comfortable silence between them. They moved cautiously, avoiding the main trails, their eyes constantly scanning the ridges for any sign of pursuit. Jacob found himself watching Alara, admiring the easy way she handled her horse, the calm competence with which she navigated the rugged terrain. She was tough, pragmatic, and saw the world without the filter of idealized memory that had clouded his own vision for so long. Silver Creek was a ghost of a town clinging to the side of a mountain like a broken promise. Most of the buildings were dilapidated shells, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at a world that had forgotten them. A handful of prospectors and stubborn old-timers still lingered, living amongst the ruins. Following the faint memory of a name Alara's father had once mentioned, they found an old man named Jedediah sitting on the porch of what used to be the assayer's office, carving a piece of wood. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes a pale, watery blue. Vance and Cain. Jedediah rasped after they explained why they were there. His carving knife paused. Haven't heard those names together in 20 years. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. They were partners, all right. Young, ambitious fellas, sank every penny they had into the North Star mine up on the mountain. Thomas Vance was the planner, the businessman. Marcus Cain was the heart, the one with the dreams. What happened? Jacob asked, his voice tight. The North Star was rich. Jedediah said, his eyes distant. For a while. Then the supports gave way. The whole western tunnel collapsed, trapped a dozen men. Marcus Cain was one of them. They never got the bodies out. A cold pit formed in Jacob's stomach. Silas's father had died in that mine. After that, the old man continued. The mine was declared unsafe, worthless. Thomas Vance had taken out a big insurance policy on it. He collected the money and left town. The families of the men who died, including the Cains, got nothing. People said Vance was lucky. Others said he was something else. The insinuation hung in the dusty air. Before Jacob could ask more, the sharp crack of a rifle echoed from the rocks above the town. A splinter of wood exploded from the porch post, inches from Jedediah's head. Ambush! Alara yelled, drawing her pistol and shoving Jacob toward the cover of the decaying building. Two men on the ridge above opened fire, their bullets thudding into the weathered planks around them. They were Cain's men. They had been followed. Jacob drew his own revolver, his mind reeling. While he provided covering fire, Alara slipped out the back. She was a shadow moving through the ruins, using the crumbling walls and abandoned mining carts as cover. Jacob saw her working her way up the far side of the gully, flanking their attackers. He kept firing, drawing their attention, the roar of his gun, a furious beat against the ringing in his ears. A bullet grazed his arm, a searing line of fire. He grit his teeth, ignoring the pain. Then two shots rang out from a new angle. One of the ambushers cried out and fell. The other, startled, turned toward the sound, and Jacob seized the opportunity. He took careful aim and fired. The second man dropped his rifle and slumped behind the rocks. Silence descended, broken only by the whistling wind. Alara emerged from the rocks, her face grim. "They won't be the last," she said, tearing a strip from her shirt to bandage his arm. Their eyes met, and in that moment their reluctant alliance was forged into something stronger, a bond sealed in shared danger. They had survived, but the message was clear. Silas Cain would kill to keep the secrets of Silver Creek buried. The blood on his sleeve was a stark crimson reminder of how close they had come to ending their journey in the dust of Silver Creek. The ambush had shaken Jacob to his core, but it had also hardened his resolve. Cain was not just trying to ruin him. He was actively trying to erase him. Jedediah mentioned insurance. Alara said, her voice low, as she tightened the makeshift bandage on Jacob's arm. And town records. The old courthouse is still standing. If there was a policy, there'll be a record of it. The courthouse was a skeleton of a building, its roof sagging and its doors hanging from single hinges. Inside, dust motes danced in the slanted rays of light, filtering through the grime-caked windows. The air was stale, thick with the smell of decay and forgotten history. Rows of ledgers and file boxes lined the walls, their contents spilling onto the floor in a chaotic jumble. It took them hours of painstaking work, their hands and faces soon covered in a fine layer of grime. They sifted through brittle pages of property deeds, mining claims, and legal filings, the history of a dead town passing through their fingers. Finally, in a heavy leather-bound ledger labeled County Insurance Claims, Alara found it. "Jacob, look at this." He leaned over her shoulder. The entry was dated 20 years ago. The claimant, Thomas Vance. The property insured the North Star Mine. The reason for the claim, catastrophic structural failure and collapse. And at the bottom, the payout amount. It was a staggering sum, more money than Jacob could possibly imagine. Enough to buy a dozen ranches like his. But it was the line below that made his breath catch in his throat. Partnership Dissolution Agreement. It was an official record stamped and signed. The partnership between Thomas Vance and Marcus Kane was legally dissolved. The day before, the mine collapsed. According to the document, Marcus Kane had sold his half of the mine to Thomas Vance for a token sum. He sold his share. Jacob breathed a wave of relief washing over him. My father owned the mine outright when it collapsed. Kane got out before the accident. It doesn't make sense. Alara countered, her brow furrowed. Why would he sell his share in a profitable mine for almost nothing? She ran her finger down the page. Look at the signatures. Jacob looked closer. His father's signature was there, the familiar, confident script. Below it was Marcus Kane's, but it was different from the signature on other documents they'd seen. It was shaky, almost illegible, as if signed under duress. Or it was forged. Jacob finished, the terrible realization dawning. The story was suddenly horribly clear. His father, perhaps seeing signs of the mine's instability, had forged his partner's signature on a dissolution agreement. He had taken sole ownership of the mine, and when it collapsed the next day, killing Marcus Kane, he was the sole beneficiary of the massive insurance policy. He hadn't just been lucky. He had orchestrated the entire thing. The idealized image of his father, the one he had carried in his heart his entire life, shattered into a million pieces. Thomas Vance, the pillar of the community, the man of unimpeachable honor, was a fraud. He had stolen from his partner and left his family, Silas's family, with nothing but grief and ruin. Silas Kane wasn't seeking revenge for a perceived betrayal. He was seeking retribution for a very real one. This wasn't a vendetta born of misunderstanding. It was justice twisted by 20 years of hatred into a cruel and calculated campaign of destruction. Silas wasn't trying to take what Jacob had. He was taking back what he believed was stolen from him, intent on destroying Jacob's legacy just as his own had been destroyed. Jacob staggered back from the ledger, feeling as if the floor had fallen out from under him. The weight of his father's sin settled on his shoulders, a crushing, suffocating burden. He wasn't the righteous son defending an honorable legacy. He was the heir to a fortune built on a lie that had cost men their lives. The fight was no longer about land or a watch or even survival. It was about a 20-year-old crime, and the sins of the father were now finally being visited upon the son. The ride back to redemption was a long, silent penance. The truth sat between Jacob and Alara, a heavy, unspoken thing. The world looked different to Jacob now. The vast, open plains felt claustrophobic, the brilliant sky oppressive. Every rock and tree seemed to bear witness to his father's deceit. He was no longer the hero of his own story. He was the unwitting villain, the beneficiary of a crime he was only now beginning to comprehend. They arrived back in the valley under the cover of darkness, splitting up to avoid drawing attention. Jacob rode toward his ranch, his mind a maelstrom of guilt and confusion. What could he possibly do? Exposing the truth would mean destroying his father's name forever, validating every move Silas Kane had made against him. But to remain silent felt like being an accomplice to the original crime. As he neared his property, the low, mournful sound of distressed cattle reached him. He spurred his horse, a sense of dread tightening its grip around his chest. In the moonlight, he saw them, a small herd bunched up and agitated against his fence line. He recognized the brand on their hides immediately. The crescent moon of the Cimarron Creek Ranch. They were Ilara's cattle, and they were on his land. A trap. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Suddenly, lanterns flared to life around him. Sheriff Miller stepped out from behind a stand of cottonwood trees, his face etched with regret. 2 deputies flanked him, their shotguns held at the ready. "Evening, Jacob." The sheriff said, his voice heavy. "We got an anonymous tip. Said you've been rustling from your neighbors." "This is a setup, Sheriff. You know I wouldn't do this." Jacob protested, raising his hands slowly. From the shadows, another figure emerged. Silas Kane, mounted on his black stallion, looking down at Jacob with an expression of cold satisfaction. "It seems our respectable Mr. Vance has fallen on hard times." Kane said, his voice smooth as silk. "Desperate times call for desperate measures, I suppose. A shame to see the Vance name sullied by common thievery." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Kane, the architect of his ruin, was now framing him as a petty criminal. He had anticipated Jacob's move, knew he would uncover the truth in Silver Creek, and had this trap waiting for him. He was turning the town, the law, everyone against him. "You did this." Jacob snarled, his eyes locking on Kane's. Kane just smiled, a thin, cruel curve of his lips. "Prove it," he said softly. Sheriff Miller cleared his throat, his discomfort obvious. "I have to take you in, son. The evidence is right here." Jacob looked at the faces of the deputies, at the reluctant determination in the sheriff's eyes. They saw a rustler caught red-handed. They wouldn't listen to a wild story about a 20-year-old conspiracy. He was trapped. If he went with them, Kane would have won. He would rot in a cell while the 30-day foreclosure period expired, and he would lose everything. He had only one choice. In one fluid motion, he dug his heels into his horse's flanks. The animal lunged forward, catching the deputies by surprise. A shotgun blast tore through the air, but Jacob was already moving, galloping hard into the darkness of the open range. "Don't let him get away," he heard the sheriff yell. He rode like a man possessed, the wind whipping at his face. He was a fugitive now, hunted by the law, hated by his neighbors, and haunted by the sins of his father. Kane had not just taken his land and his legacy. He had taken his name, turning him into an outcast and in the only home he had ever known. He was utterly alone, with nothing left but a terrible truth that no one would believe. The sandstorm hit the valley like a physical blow, a roiling wall of ochre dust that swallowed the sun and screamed across the plains. It was a biblical force, scouring the land, erasing tracks, and forcing all life to seek shelter. For Jacob, it was a reprieve, a chaotic, blinding cloak under which he could move. For 3 days he had been a ghost, living off the land, hunted by the sheriff's posse. But he knew this storm was his chance. Kane would be in town, likely in the saloon, waiting for the weather to break. It was time to end this. Time. With Ilara's help, a message left for him at a prearranged drop point, he had a plan. She had managed to convince the sheriff to hear Jacob out to meet him in the saloon, promising new evidence. It was a long shot, but it was the only one he had. Jacob slipped into redemption, a wraith in the howling gale. Sand seeped through the cracks of the buildings, and the wind moaned like a dying animal. The saloon was an island of dim light in the maelstrom. He pushed through the swinging doors, the storm blasting in behind him. The saloon fell silent. The few patrons huddled at the bar turned to stare. Sheriff Miller was there, standing by the fireplace, his face grim. And at a table in the center of the room, calmly pouring a glass of whiskey, sat Silas Kane. "Mr. Vance." Kane said, his voice a low purr that carried over the storm's roar. "I must commend your persistence, though I confess I expected a less dramatic entrance." "It's over, Kane." Jacob said, his voice raw. He ignored the sheriff, his focus entirely on the man who had destroyed his life. "Over." Kane chuckled, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. "My dear boy, it has barely begun. You came here to tell them your story, didn't you? A tale of forged documents and a 20-year-old crime. A desperate fiction from a desperate man." "It's the truth," Jacob said, stepping forward. "My father, Thomas Vance, forged your father's signature. He stole the North Star mine, and he took the insurance money that should have gone to your family. He laid it all bare, the words costing him everything. He was destroying his own father's name in front of the town's chief lawman." The sheriff's eyes widened, but Kane just smiled. "An excellent story. But you've missed the most important part." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper for Jacob's ears alone, yet carrying in the tense silence. "Your father wasn't a monster, Jacob. He wasn't a cold-blooded killer. He was just a coward." The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, each second a hammer blow in the suffocating quiet. The mine was failing. Kane continued. "The engineers had warned them both that a collapse was imminent. My father, Marcus, wanted to shut it down, cut his losses. But your father, he had a wife, a young son. He had this ranch to think of. He couldn't afford to lose everything. So he offered my father a deal. Let him take the fall, let him die in the accident. And Thomas would use the insurance money to provide for both families. A secret trust." Jacob stared, his mind struggling to process this new, more terrible twist. "But my father refused." Silas said, his voice laced with a sudden sharp venom. "He would not sacrifice his life for your father's prosperity. So Thomas Vance did what weak men do. He didn't cause the collapse. He simply let it happen. He knew the supports were failing, and he did nothing. He stood by while a dozen men, including his partner, went to their deaths. Then he took the full insurance payout to save his own family, leaving ours with nothing but an unmarked grave on a mountainside." The truth was not black and white. It was a sickening, murky gray. His father wasn't a calculating murderer, but a man who, in a moment of desperate fear, had made a monstrously selfish choice. This wasn't a story of good versus evil. It was a tragedy of human failing. I have spent 20 years imagining this moment. Silas hissed, his composure finally cracking. His hand drifted slowly toward the pistol at his hip. "I will take your land, your name, and your life. I will finish what your father started. An eye for an eye." Jacob saw it all then, the lifetime of bitterness that had twisted Silas into this creature of vengeance. But he also saw the path before him. He could kill Silas, give in to the same cycle of revenge. Or he could end it. He made his choice. He didn't draw his gun. "You're right," Jacob said, his voice clear and steady. "What my father did was wrong. It was unforgivable, and you have paid a price for it. But killing me won't undo it. It won't bring your father back. It will only make you the man you think my father was." For a moment, Silas hesitated, thrown by the confession, the lack of a fight. In that instant, Sheriff Miller made his move. He drew his pistol. "It's over, Kane. Drop it." Silas's face contorted in a mask of pure rage. He drew his gun, but not at the sheriff. He aimed at Jacob. But Jacob was already moving, diving across the table, not to attack, but to disarm. He slammed into Silas, and the two men crashed to the floor. The gun went off the shot, burying itself harmlessly in the ceiling. Jacob wrenched the pistol from Silas's hand as the deputies swarmed in, restraining him. The fight was over. The wind howled outside, and the ticking clock marked the end of a 20-year war. Jacob stood his body, aching, his soul stripped bare. He had not won through violence or vengeance, but by facing the ugly truth of his own legacy. He had chosen justice, not revenge, and in doing so had finally broken the chain of his father's sin. Part 9. The Falling Action. As if on cue, the sandstorm began to recede. The wind's furious howl softened to a mournful sigh, and pale, watery light began to filter through the saloon's dusty windows. The storm, both outside and in, had broken. Silas Kane, his face a mask of disbelief and defeated rage, was hauled to his feet by the deputies. He stared at Jacob, his eyes burning with a hatred that was now impotent. "This isn't over, Vance," he spat, but the words lacked their earlier venom. They were the hollow threats of a man who had lost. Sheriff Miller clapped a hand on Jacob's shoulder. "That took courage, son. More than I've seen in a long time." He looked from Jacob to the sputtering Kane. "There's a lot to sort out here. Bank robbery, attempted murder, and some old ghosts, it seems." He nodded toward the door. "You're cleared of the rustling charges. We found the tracks of Kane's men leading from Alara's ranch. She was right to trust you." The truth, once revealed, had spread through the saloon's few patrons, and it would spread through the town like wildfire. They looked at Jacob now, not as a fugitive, but with a newfound respect. He had not hidden from his family's shame. He had confronted it. After Kane was led away, in handcuffs bound for the nearest federal marshal, Jacob stepped outside. The air was clean and washed, and the dust settled by a light rain that had followed the storm. The world felt new. Alara was waiting for him, her horse tied next to his. She had been watching from the livery stable across the street, a rifle resting in the crook of her arm, ready. She didn't say anything at first, just walked over and gently checked the graze on his arm from the ambush. Her touch was light, practical, but held a warmth that went deeper than the skin. "The image I had of my father," Jacob began, his voice rough with emotion, "is gone. Shattered. Maybe that's for the best," Alara said, meeting his gaze. Her own eyes were filled with a complex understanding. "We carry them with us, Jacob, but we don't have to be defined by their mistakes. My father used to tell me stories about Silver Creek, always glossing over the worst of it. I think he knew or suspected and couldn't face it. We carry these idealized pictures because it's easier than seeing them as flawed people." They stood in the quiet aftermath, the town slowly coming back to life around them. The weight that had burdened Jacob for so long felt lighter. He had lost the father he thought he knew, but in his place was a more complicated, more human figure. A man who had made a terrible choice out of fear, not malice. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of understanding. "What now?" Alara asked. "The foreclosure notice is void," Jacob said. "Kane's assets will be frozen, his contracts investigated. The ranch is safe." The words felt strange, anticlimactic. He had saved his home, but the victory felt sober, not triumphant. He had won, but the cost had been the very legacy he had set out to protect. He looked at Alara, at her strong, steady presence. She had stood by him, questioned him, and ultimately saved him. Their bond was no longer one of proximity or reluctant alliance. It was forged in truth and shared peril. "Thank you." He said the two words, carrying the weight of everything he couldn't yet articulate. She simply nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "Come on," she said. "Let's go home." In the days that followed, a fragile peace settled over redemption. With Silas Kane's empire crumbling under federal investigation, the town began to breathe again. The foreclosure notice on the Vance ranch was officially nullified. The land was his free and clear. A week after the storm, Jacob rode out to the small windswept cemetery on the hill overlooking his ranch. He stopped before a simple granite headstone that read, "Thomas Vance, beloved husband and father." For a long time he just stood there, the silence broken only by the rustle of the wind through the tall grass. The anger and the disillusionment had faded, replaced by a quiet, aching sorrow. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver pocket watch. The sheriff had returned it to him from Kane's personal effects. It felt heavy in his palm, a relic of a complicated past. It was a symbol of his father's honor, but also of his failings. A symbol of a legacy both proud and stained. He polished the silver casing with his thumb, watching the engraved oak tree catch the afternoon light. It was a beautiful thing, but it was an anchor to a past that no longer owned him. With a final deep breath, he leaned down and placed the watch on the headstone, resting it gently against the cold granite. He was not rejecting his father, but accepting him for the flawed man he was. He was letting go of the burden of a perfect legacy and choosing to build his own. He turned and walked away, without looking back, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders with every step. He returned to the ranch to find Alara on his porch, a small crate of tools at her feet. She had been helping him with repairs, their work falling into an easy, comfortable rhythm that felt like the beginning of something new. She looked up as he approached, a question in her eyes. He didn't need to say anything. She saw the change in him, the peace that had settled where the storm had been. "I was clearing out the attic," she said, gesturing toward the house. "Found some of my father's old things. Thought you might want to look through this box. It was mixed in with his belongings, but it has your father's name on it." It was a small, dusty wooden box, the kind used for storing important papers. Jacob took it, a flicker of curiosity stirring. Inside, beneath some old deeds, was a single sealed envelope addressed to him in his father's hand. His heart pounded in his chest. The letter was dated just a week before his father's death from a sudden illness. His hands trembled as he opened it. "My dearest Jacob." The letter began the script weaker than he remembered. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and I have left you with a burden you do not deserve. There are things a man keeps secret, hoping to take them to his grave. But secrets have a way of poisoning the soil for the next generation. You deserve the truth. 20 years ago in a town called Silver Creek, I failed. I failed my partner, Marcus Kane, and I failed myself. I was a young man terrified of losing everything I had built for you and your mother. I saw a way to save us, but it was a coward's path. I stood by and let good men die, and I lived the rest of my life with their ghosts. The money from the insurance built this ranch into what it is today, but it was blood money, and it has brought me no peace. I have tried to live an honorable life since, to make amends in small ways, but a debt like that can never be truly repaid. I know that Marcus's son Silas survived. I fear he carries his father's hate. If he ever comes here, know that his anger is justified, even if his methods are not. Do not let my sin become your battle. Your legacy is your own to write. I ask not for your respect, which I no longer deserve, but for your forgiveness. Be a better man than I was. Your loving father, Thomas. Tears streamed down Jacob's face, hot and cleansing. It wasn't an excuse, but it was a confession. It was remorse. His father had not died an unrepentant sinner. He had died a man trapped by his own guilt, praying for his son's freedom. This final letter was the piece he never knew he was missing. It was the gift of closure. He looked up from the letter, his vision blurred, and saw Alara watching him with quiet compassion. The future was no longer a shadow of the past. It was an open field waiting for him to plant something new. He had his home. He had the truth. And he had a partner to help him build a legacy defined not by secrets and sorrow, but by honesty, courage, and a love forged in the heart of the unforgiving West.